Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we are teaching you how to play Worms, the board game. Now this is a game for 2 to 4 players, ages 10 plus, and takes about 45 minutes to play. Over on Board Game Geek, they do say that it is best at 4 players. The community says it's best at 4 players. That's only with 7 votes though, so keep that in mind. They recommend it for ages 12 and up, but that's only 3 votes there. And then the complexity is 2.14 out of 5, again with only 7 votes though, so take all of those recommendations with a grain of salt. And now let's teach you how to play Worms, the board game. To begin setup, place the wind dial out on the table. The first player during setup is the youngest player, but this will change for the start of the game. Starting with the first player and going clockwise, take turns to place a single map tile. Map tiles must be placed touching the wind dial, or they must touch any already placed tile by joining one or more edges. So maybe this is how the first one is played, and then the next one might be placed out like this. This also means that in a 2-player game, only 2 map tiles will be played out. In a 3-player game, 3 map tiles will be played out. And in a 4-player game, 4 map tiles will be played. For each player in the game, collect the following: 4 worms in one selected color, a supply crate, a mine, and an oil drum. Place all of these things, including the worms, near the map within easy reach of the players. Now, starting with the first player and going clockwise, players will take one of the things from this pile of things and place it on a hex on the map. Keep in mind at this point, no player has selected a team, and there are no right or wrong choices when placing things. However, keep in mind, it's dangerous for a worm to be on the same hex as an oil drum or a mine, so take that into account when setting up the teams. Also, there can be no more than 3 things in any one hex. As an example, this might be what a 2-player game looks like after the things have been placed on the board. Next, shuffle the reference cards and randomly deal them out to each player. This will let the players know which team they are on. Next, separate out the starting weapon cards, which have this dark back to them, and give each player a bazooka, ninja rope, Uzi, and girder. Then, shuffle up the remainder of the starting weapons and deal 1 more to each player, so this player may end up with another Uzi. Now, every player should have 5 cards, each of them with this darker back. This is the player's starting hand of cards. They need to keep these secret at all times until they play them. Now create a supply deck by shuffling all of the non-starter weapon cards and place them in a deck near the play area. Next, shuffle up the drop deck. Randomly choose a sudden death card. Place this sudden death card near the play area. Take 2 drop cards per player, so in this case 4. Take 2 more drop cards, so in this case 6 total. Shuffle them together and place them on top of the sudden death card. This is the drop deck. You can return the remaining drop cards, starting weapon cards, and sudden death cards to the box. They won't be used this game. Players now check the bottom of their reference cards to see who has the lower number. Blue is always 1, yellow 2, red 3, green 4, and that player receives the target token and is now the first player. That player now rolls a die. If they don't receive a numerical value, they will roll it again until they do. So in this case, 5. And they will now set the wind direction arrow to that number. Worms is played in turns, with each player moving their chosen worm, picking up weapons, and using them to wipe out the other teams. The game ends 1 round after a player is eliminated, at which point the player with the most worms standing wins. Now, of course, in a 2-player game, that means the game ends as soon as 1 player is wiped out. Beginning with the player holding the target token, players will take turns one at a time clockwise around the board. During a player's turn, they are considered the active player and will choose an active worm. Players can use the player reference on the back of the rulebook to keep in mind what happens during a turn. Turns are resolved in this order: choose worm to activate, heal that worm if it's damaged, inch or jump again, play a weapon card, end turn, draw a weapon card, and pass the target token to the player on your left. Also, before we get into more detail about each of those steps, keep in mind the general rule that if 2 or more effects are triggered at the same time, the player whose turn it is may choose what order they are resolved. And if a rule on a card and a rule in the book contradict one another, follow the rules on the card. The first step of a player's turn is to activate a worm. So a player will choose any of their worms to be their active worm. So, for instance, maybe I will choose this one. If your chosen worm is in the same hex as a supply crate, which this one is, remove the crate and draw a card from the supply deck. If your active worm is damaged, which means they would be lying on their side, you now place it upright, which means it is back to full health and is ready to fight. Step 3 is inch or jump. During this step, your worm may move in a couple of different ways, either inching or jumping. To inch, simply move the worm from a land hex to another land hex. When jumping, choose any hex within 2 hexes of the worm's current hex and move the worm into that hex, like this. You will then have to scatter the worm. When something needs to be scattered, roll a die. On a 1 through 6, move the target or thing 1 hex in the rolled direction. So in this case, here. If this symbol were rolled, then you would move the target or thing 1 hex in the wind direction. And if this symbol were rolled, then the target or thing does not move. If a worm moves into the same hex as a mine, destroy the mine, and then flip the danger flipper. If it lands safety side up, then the mine was a dud. Otherwise, the mine explodes. You will need to resolve a blast in the hex. Place a crater in the hex, and then damage and scatter each thing that's in that hex. You will scatter the worms first, and then anything else that's in the blast. A 1 through 6 scatters them in the direction on the dial. This symbol scatters them in the direction of the wind, and this symbol damages the thing. This means that since the worms are already damaged from the initial blast, if they receive an additional damage, they will die and be removed from play. It's also important to realize that the crater counts as a thing, which means that that hex now will always have 1 thing in it, are immovable and indestructible. If there are ever 3 craters in a hex, destroy everything else in it, remove the craters, and replace the hex with water. If a worm moves into the same hex as fire, destroy the fire and flip the danger flipper. If it lands safety side up, nothing happens. Otherwise, the worm gets damaged. If a worm moves into the same hex as a supply crate, the supply crate is removed from the map and the player draws a supply card. If a worm moves into a full hex, this hex already has 3 things, the worm moves in. After completing any effects from the move, if that hex still has 4 or more things in it, choose a worm in the hex to prod. When you prod a thing, you knockback scatter it. Knockback scatter works exactly like regular scatter, except the target symbol allows the person causing the knockback to choose the direction. That means that you could choose to move the worm off the map into the water, and it dies. If there are no worms to prod, you may instead choose a non-crater thing to prod. Finally, during your inch or jump step, you can choose not to move at all. Either way, the 4th step is then inch or jump again, and you follow the exact same rules as step 3, again choosing either to move or not. Step 5 is to play a weapon card. You can choose a weapon from your hand, and then complete the actions on the card by reading across the action line. So this first symbol here means to resolve the text on the card. All text must be resolved in order, and all text must be resolved before moving on to the next action in the action line. We won't go through all of the various keywords that you might find on these cards, but page 16 of the rulebook will have the answers for you there. Some cards will have this symbol multiple times. Each time you reach that symbol on the action line, you resolve the text on the card. After resolving the text for this symbol, then with the bazooka, you would have this symbol, which means the worm may inch or jump, just as they do in step 3 and 4. If multiple of this symbol are present, then the worm may move multiple times, once for each symbol. If you see this symbol, it means that you then get to play another weapon card from your hand. So, as an example for this bazooka, we must target a direct hex, which means it must be directly in line with one of the 6 directions on the wind die. So basically firing straight out from one of the sides of our hex. So in this case, let's choose this direction. It then says accuracy 4. Many weapons will become less accurate as they are fired at longer ranges, and accuracy reflects this. So since the bazooka is accuracy 4, we will start with 4 dice. Then, since the target is adjacent or inside of the same hex as our active worm, we will roll all 4 dice. However, if it were farther away, so let's say this is the worm that we're targeting. We would place the target marker on that worm, and now we have accuracy 4. We can see this worm is 2 spaces away, which means we would have to move 1 space in order to be adjacent. So we take our 4 accuracy dice from accuracy 4 and remove 1 because of the distance. And now we would roll these. So we see we've got 2 5s and a direct hit. We get to choose which one we want to use. If we had used a 5, it would move the target here, which also might not be a bad situation. We could blow up the mine and blow up this worm all at the same time. But we could also choose to do a direct hit since we have this die here. Keep in mind, this means that you don't have to fire at a space with a worm in it. You can try to hope that the wind will actually move the target token into a space. So with the bazooka, it's a direct hex weapon, which means we can't actually target this hex right here. But we could target this hex. And now that that hex is adjacent, we would roll 4 dice. And we would hope that we would be able to use this right here to use the wind to then move the target into this hex. And now we've actually hit the intended target. After resolving the weapon card, it will be the end of turn step. There are some effects that will trigger at the end of the turn. The draw a drop card step has the player draw the top card from the drop deck and resolve the text on the card. All the text on the card must be resolved, and it must be resolved from top to bottom. So in this case, we would place a supply crate in the emptiest hex, which would be this one. Place an oil drum in that same hex. There. Remove 3 fires from the map. Well, there are no fires, so we don't have to worry about that. And then change the wind direction. To change the wind direction, you roll a die. On a 1 through 6, you point the wind in the direction indicated. With this symbol, you do not change the wind direction. And with this symbol, you do not change the wind direction. So in this case, it would now be heading in this direction. After the drop card is fully resolved, discard it back to the box. The last card of the drop deck is the sudden death card. When a sudden death card is revealed and resolved, place it face up near the map rather than discarding it. For the rest of the game, whenever you would resolve a drop card at this step, simply resolve the drop portion of the sudden death card instead. In this case, place a water hex on a land hex that contains no worms. Then place a supply crate in the emptiest hex and change the wind direction. You then pass the target token to the next player in clockwise order, and it is now their turn. When a player's team has no remaining worms, they are out of the game and eliminated. If there are more than 2 players in the game, this will trigger the end of the game. Players will finish the current player's turn, and then each player takes one more turn, including the player who just finished their turn. After that, the player with the most worms remaining wins the game. If there's a tie, the player with the most undamaged worms wins the game. If there's still a tie, the game ends in a draw. I do want to point out that on page 14 of the rules, there is a way to set up for your first game if you want a more clear direction in exactly how to play the first game and be more specific. However, feel free to also set up your first game with the setup rules described, which are the normal setup rules for most of your games. There are a number of keywords and terms on page 16 through 22. As different terms come up during the game, be sure to take a look at the keywords in there and to get more information about exactly what those terms and keywords mean. And finally, there are some optional rules that you can use on page 23 to add some more adventurous feeling to the game. And that's how you play Worms the board game. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. Please share the video, all that great stuff. Leave comments below. Be sure to come back and check out other great videos coming up, such as how to play Kingdom Death Monsters Gambler's Chest Expansion Part 5, how to play Dungeon Universalis Part 5, and other fantastic stuff. We're even going to be bringing how to play Starship Interstellar in the near future. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.